welcome to From the Files of Dr. Mac, hosted by J.J. McCollister. The heritage portion of interests, Blacks in the Bible, Her Story, includes women in the Bible, prominent issues which can be handled with biblical Christian counseling, as well as comments regarding current media content regarding women. And now, Dr. Mac.
Hello, and welcome to From the Files of Dr. Mac. I am your host, Dr. Mac. I'd like to thank you for joining us today. We're going to focus on our Women in the Bible series, and we will be working from the book of Numbers. So, I am going to ask you, if you will, to say, okay, I have read the book of Numbers and I am excited about this particular book. However, it's not usually the response that we get. Our goal today is to continue our study of the books of the Torah with a focus on the book of Numbers, to review the interpretations of a woman within the book of Numbers, Cosby, and to share recent interpretations of the plight of Cosby in terms of religious scapegoating and/or sacred lynching. We will also conclude with some comments written by Willa Gaffrey and by James Cone. Now, biblical source. Numbers chapter 21, verse 1, verses 6 through 9, 15, 18, and Numbers chapter 31. The book of Numbers is the fourth book in the Bible. It is also the fourth of the 5 books written in the Jewish Torah. As the name suggests, the book of Numbers is a census of the people, tribes, and other aspects of the nation of of the nation of Israel. Definite difference there. At first glance, the name Numbers may not sound appealing and interesting to some people. However, if you're not into numbers and statistics, you might automatically dismiss this book based solely on its title. But those who study the book may be surprised to discover that it contains many important spiritual principles and lessons. It's a book of history that records many of God's miraculous deeds as the Israelites wandered in the wilderness. Another name for this book, by the way, is In the Wilderness. At its heart is the question of where the Israelites are located geographically. But the question should be, where are they found spiritually? The author of the book of Numbers is Moses. Though the book doesn't come with a specific byline with Moses' name on it, the evidence of Moses' authorship of the book of Numbers is strong. The book begins by describing how God spoke to Moses. Now the Lord spoke to Moses in the wilderness of Sinai. That's Numbers chapter 1, verse 1. Throughout the book, the phrase the Lord spoke to Moses, or some form of it, shows up more than 50 times. Since the book records so many words that God spoke directly to Moses, Moses would have been the logical person to record these interactions. The book of Numbers is essentially a sequel to the book of Exodus, picking up where Exodus leaves off. The evidence that Moses wrote the book of Exodus is strong and supports the fact that the book of Numbers is a follow-up. The book itself tells us Moses was the writer who kept written records. So in chapter 33, verse 2, we read, Now Moses wrote down the starting points of their journey at the command of the Lord. Moses was educated in the Egyptian court and may have been one of the few people among the Israelites to have the literacy and the writing skills to write this book. And that comes from Acts 7, chapter 22nd verse. The New Testament books validate that Moses is the writer. So when was the book written? The book was written uh, 38 years after they had been in the wilderness. It covers the span of 38 years, and it begins with the second month of the second year after the Israelis' exodus from Egypt, and it ends in the 10th month of the 40th year after the exodus. It is possible that Moses wrote the contents of the book throughout those 38 years like a journal, or wrote it at the end of the 40th year. In either case, Moses would have completed the book of Numbers around 1404 BC. The book of Numbers has 36 chapters and can be divided thusly into three categories. Chapters 1 through 10, the Israelites at Mount Sinai. Chapters 11 through 20, the Israelites wander the wilderness and settle at Kadesh. Chapters 21 through 36, the Israelites enter the plains of Moab and the Transjordan region. It is chapters 28 that we will focus on today. There are many major events in the book of Numbers. However, we will follow up on some, but our focus, as said earlier, will be on the fact they fell into sexual sin and idolatry at Baal-Peor, and God sends a plague as punishment, which is ended by the bold action of Phineas. And that's Numbers chapter 25, verses 1 through 18. Now, themes in the book of Numbers: God's presence among his people. This is one of the most beautiful passages in there. The Creator God made his presence visibly known among his people. Now, on the day that the tabernacle was raised up, the cloud covered the tabernacle, the tent of testimony. From evening until morning, it was above the tabernacle, like the appearance of fire. So it was always the cloud covered it by day, and the appearance of fire by night. What a beautiful vision there. The people moved when the cloud was taken up and camped when it descended. The Israelites understood that as long as the cloud rested above the tabernacle, they were to remain camped in the presence of God. The tribes were arranged in order around the tabernacle where God's presence was located, with the Levites in the middle. Now, one of the other themes there, after such a beautiful image, there was grumbling, and that grumbling angered God. Despite God's day and night presence in their midst, the people constantly were guilty of murmuring and grumbling, even to the point of wanting to overthrow Moses and choose another leader to take them back to Egypt. That's in Numbers chapter 14, verse 4. Numbers, therefore, is not just a mere bit of ancient history, but it is a complex story of unfaithfulness, rebellion, and frustration set against the background of God's faithfulness, presence, provision, and forbearance. The people soon forgot the hardships of Egyptian slavery and lusted after the food of the land of their captivity. They liked gratitude despite God's providing them daily with their needs. Despite all of their complaining and the other ways they displeased him, God remained patient with the Israelites. This teaches us that God is an incredibly patient, merciful, and faithful person. Their complaining and unfaithfulness displeased him and disqualified that generation from entering the promised land. This is in Numbers chapter 11, verse 1, again in verses 26 and 39. As we go through, we will understand that despite all of their complaining and the other ways they displease God, and we're focusing on one of the major ones today, God remained patient with them. So God remains patient with us. Another theme, Moses as an intercessor. Moses, on a number of occasions, acted as a personal intercessor on behalf of the people. Now, we remember back in Exodus, we were talking about Zipporah with the complaints from Miriam and Aaron. When Aaron went to Moses, he said to him, "Oh, my Lord, please do not lay this sin on us, which we have done foolishly, and in which we have sinned." Then Moses then interceded, and after 7 days of banishment outside the camp, Miriam was healed of the leprosy. Now, as we go on down, we find that he sent out 12 spies, and 10 of them returned with, "You can't do this kind of thing," a negative report. But Moses remained the intercessor, and he had to do that because the people were doing things that were not pleasing in God's sight. When we talk about where this occurred, we have to do something a little bit differently. Here we're going to look at a cultural setting as well as the physical setting. In the book of Numbers, the Israelites experienced the failure of an aborted conquest of Canaan and the years of trial when God instructed and disciplined his children in the wilderness wandering. During those years of wandering, the old generation died and the new generation grew to maturity, a generation that had not known slavery and the worship of false gods in Egypt. Raised in obedience to the divine law of the Sinai covenant, the vigorous new generation of children of Israel were fully prepared to become Yahweh's holy warriors and the conquerors of the promised land. What characters do we have today? Well, we have God, we have Moses, we have Phineas, we have Shamir, the son of Sula, we have Cosby, the daughter of Zu, we have Baal, the false god, we have Balaam, the one who thought, the magician, the sorcerer, we have Balak, the king of Moab, we have the Moabite women, we have the Mennonite women. And we'll be working with terms such as sexual immaturity or sexual immorality. We'll be talking about idolatry and harlotry and the word aftermath. Something occurred and something else occurred. We've already talked about the ingratitude, the grumbling, and the mumbling that was going on. We'll mention a little bit about the sacred rites of prostitution and the fact that there was a plague in the camp and the final command given by God to Moses. We'll define each of those as we go through. Let's take a look at the biblical background. The Israelites camped in Moab on the way to Canaan. Israel was influenced by the Moabites to worship false gods. God commanded Moses to publicly kill the 24,000 people involved in that, publicly kill those who were involved. And Phineas, who was Aaron's relative and also Moses' relative, stopped the plague by killing 2 people and removing the wrath of God from Israel. Given you the text already, but I'd like to give it to you again. Background is going to come from Numbers 22 and include 25, 31, and verses 15 to 16, and also Revelation 2nd chapter, verse 14. Now, The Moabite ruler was afraid when Israel came to his land. That's in chapter 22. The Mennonites joined the Moabites to hide Balaam, who was a prophet of sorts, who talked to a donkey to curse Israel. But God protected Israel as usual, and that didn't occur. So who were these Moabites? Who were these Mennonites? The Mennonites were descendants of the son of Abraham and his wife Keturah. We've talked about that before, but if you like, you can go back to Genesis 25 and verses 1 through 2. Who were the Moabites? Um, Moab was the son of Lot and his oldest daughter after the destruction of Sodom and Gomorrah. Go back to Genesis 19 chapter verses 30 to 38. So God punished the Moabites because they did not provide bread or water to the Israelites when they came out of bondage in Egypt. And we'll see more of that in our next session, which is in Deuteronomy 23rd chapter, verses 3 through 5. And we'll define the characters more clearly as we go through. Now, we have a major two. We know we're going to be talking about two very young people and how and what happened to them, and whether or not they are guilty of what they have been accused of. And let's go now to the conflict. Conflict was Israel and the Israelites bowed down to Baal, a false god. I'd like to remind you this is the first time that they are encountering Baal, but it will not be the last. But this is the first time. So we have sexual immorality, adultery, and an aftermath. In verses 1 through 3 of chapter 25, Israel harlotry with the women of Moab. Now Israel remained in the plain there on Transjordan, and the people began to commit harlotry with the women of Moab. They invited the people to the sacrifices of their gods, and the people ate and bowed down to their gods. So Israel was joined to Baal-peor, and the anger of the Lord was aroused against Israel. And the people began to commit these sins of the flesh with the women of Moab. The women were coming among the men of Israel. They were able to seduce them to both sexual sin and adultery. And the two were commonly connected in perverse forms of idol worship in the ancient world. Now, to bow down, to commit harlotry, it's normally a behavior associated with what we term as a loose woman or a harlot. Here, the people, as a man, behold himself and with these foreign women, and they were pagan women, and as always in ancient Near East, referenced themselves with sexual imagery to suggest an interconnecting circle of sexual immorality tied with the the um, the sacred rites of prostitution, which was an essential part of the pagan religious system of the day. Now, when the sacrifices ended, they would step aside to a grove of their god. Certain areas were declared to be designated for the god, and they would become brute beasts, and they would satisfy their lusts. Um, the Israel sin with Baal also carried a strong sense of ingratitude because we remembered from Exodus that God just had been wonderful towards them by protecting them and feeding them. But here we go. They were bowing down to a false god. But in his best efforts, Balaam, the prophet, the false prophet, who was engaged by Balak, who was the king of Moab, to curse them. But instead of that, God caused this man, evil man, instead of cursing, his curses became blessings. So their harlotry was both sexual and spiritual, and it was a form of ingratitude. Now, the women were sometimes described as not Moabites but Mennonites, and sometimes vice versa. This is because the Mennonites were a nomadic group, and in this period they were in high numbers among the Moabites. And the place, Josephus describes a place of this camp as a site located 7 miles east of Jordan and about 5 miles north of the Dead Sea. It's a general area of just a few miles, um, whereby, well, adjacent to Moab and Jericho. And it was the geographical setting for the remainder of the Israelites' sojourn before entering the Promised Land. Now, with this sexual encounter, this basically became Israel becoming joined to Baal Peor. And remember, no other god before. So Baal was the great Canaanite fertility god, and the worship of Baal was a constant temptation for the children of Israel. Balaam being prophesied from the high place of Baal, that's in Numbers chapter 22, verse 41. It was a Baal Peor, it became known as, and here is the symbolic joining, that is the yoking or the partnering with this Canaanite god. To this point, the whole story of Exodus, and we see this sinning in many ways, as we talked about, the vocal complaints and the being ungrateful, that while God was generous in his provisions, but they worshiped another God, a false God, and that only worship should have been to the Lord God Jehovah. But we have also known them to have that golden calf, which they wanted to say represented them. Again, because those people had something that those people, meaning the Moabites and Mennonites, they had something, a visual symbol, and but that's another story. We're going to stay with our sin of adultery um, as we go through. And again, this sin, by the way, is a blasphemy against God. So Balaam had a vision, his first vision for them as a people. They would dwell alone. It was an act of rebellion against God. So corruption of the covenant occurred. So the sexual paganism was popular for the Canaanites. So, in order to entice the Israelites into their sexual liaisons with the pagan women, they had to be powerful temptresses, and they had to be so powerful that they captured people later on in our study. They captured Solomon, Israel's king, who was known for his wisdom, in 1 Kings 11th chapter, verses 1 through 10. It's not until Numbers chapter 31, verse 16, that we learn that this happened through the counseling of Balaam. In a sense, it was through Balaam's counsel that Baal worship first came to the Israelites. God was angry. He was angry with them for forsaking what they were supposed to do. It was out of fear that Balak engaged Balaam to try to do this, because the numbers for the Israelites were great at this point, and exceedingly great, and he feared the numbers. So he engaged someone he thought would be able to caused them to leave. Now the anger of the Lord was aroused against Israel, and by doing that, it was a metaphor basically. Um, he became very angry. He became full of rage. According to some commentators, we learn later that it showed itself in a plague that began to strike down thousands among the Israelites, and it seemed as if it would continue until the whole nation had been consumed. This will lead us to our discussion of our two characters today. Now, when the enemy could never accomplish against Israel, um, they couldn't do it. Balaam and Balak couldn't do it. So guess what? Israel did it themselves. They did it themselves by being disobedient. So it was the same principle as at work with people today. Uh, we get attached to sin and Satan, but we become so engrossed in it that we rebel against the Lord and the things that have been taught to us. So a nice quote to remember is the sword of no stranger, the curse of no stranger had the power to damage Israel. Only itself could bring misfortune by succeeding from God and his law. That's a nice quote to remember. So now we start off with the Moabites, and you have to really focus here. They were now the neighbors of the Israelites. So they were unable to do anything with the witchcraft. They knew they couldn't defeat them militarily, so they decided to send the women in and do what needed to be done. So the anger of the Lord was against them. Essentially, after the failure of the curse, Balaam uh, listened to the suggestion, and if you translate it in this manner, he sent the most provocative girls among them to tell them and to tempt them, the men that is, to come to the feast, to come to the worship, and not saying to them, I need you to do worship Balaam, but just come and hang with us and eat with us and, have fun with us after. So that is where we go. What I want to do today is part of that goal. We want to take a look at some interpretations here. So the Lord said to Moses, you take all the leaders of the people and you hang the offenders before the Lord out in the sun, that the fierce anger of the Lord may turn away from Israel. So Moses said to the judges of Israel, every one of you kill his men who would join with Baal or Peor. So in other words, take all the leaders and the people who are following the idol worshippers, and they are to be killed, and they are to be hanged publicly because the sin was done publicly and it cannot be kept quiet. And this is consistent with this sense of disgrace associated with unburied corpse in the Near East. So he told them to round up the tribal leaders and those persons who represent the people who presumably have have participated. Now, why? Or they're going to be the ones to do it because as tribal leaders, they were to they should have prevented the activities or carried out the punishment of the guilty members of the tribe and executed them. They were to be impaled on poles such that their bodies would hang out in the open in broad daylight. Now that was the edict that was given. That was the order that was given to the leaders. Given to the judges and on down to the leaders because they had committed the sin of adultery and immorality with the Moabite women. So the penalty was to be death. Every one of you kill his men. It had to be a difficult order. So there was an assembly of chiefs and judges who were to carry out the order. And the severe judgment was consistent with what God had promised Israel in terms of the covenant that he made with them at Mount Sinai. Quote, "Now therefore go, lead the people to the place of which I have spoken to you. Behold, my angel shall go before you. Nevertheless, in the day which I've spoken, when I visit you for punishments, I will punish, them for their sins." And that's a paraphrase of Exodus 32nd chapter, 34th verse. We have a plague, we have adultery, we have great sinning going on. So the sin was very, very bad. And because of it, in verses 6 and 9, we had a man stand up. So he stood up for the righteousness of God and he wanted to do something. So indeed, one of the children of Israel came and presented to his brethren a Midianite woman in the sight of Moses and in the sight of the congregation of the children of Israel who were weeping at the door of the tabernacle of meeting. Now, when Phinehas, the son of Eleazar, and the son of Aaron the priest, saw it, he rose from among the congregation, took up a javelin in his hand, and he went after the man of Israel into the tent and both of them through through, the man of Israel and the woman through her body. So the plague was stopped among the children of Israel, and those who died in the plague were 24,000. 24,000. So a Midianite woman in the sight of Moses in the tent, and he thrust them both through. And notice how it's translated. He thrust them both through. And when you're reading that, you automatically think with one thrust, he killed both the man and the woman. But as we go through and look at different interpretations, you'll see it could have been different and might have been different as has been interpreted. But the fact that the plague stopped is important. The Midianite woman in the sight of the congregation said at one point, one translation says that Zaire brought her to, show his brethren, but they immediately went on into the tent. But we'll look at that a little bit later. They were together in the door of the tabernacle of the meeting. So some commentators believe that they were having sex, that Zaire and Cozy were having sex immediately upon entering it. And it tactfully obscures this because it was outrageous and it was offensive. It's a flagrant act. It was a blasphemous act in the strongest sense of the word. His sin is a deliberative, provocative one designed to cause the wrath of the Lord and the wrath of those like Moses, the judges, and his grandfather, his father. So now that Phinehas, the son of Eleazar, the son Aaron the priest, saw it, he rose from among the congregation, and he becomes the one man who says, "I'm going to do something." Now, what we have to decide is this a form of sacred justice, or is this sort of vigilante justice that we're talking here, or do we need to take a look a little deeper? The immoral act that was taking place and the place that the location at which it's occurring is an abomination to begin with. He brought her in front of Moses and the congregation, and all the onlookers froze in disbelief, But one man did not remain motionless. That was Phineas. And if we look at, he's going to go back and pick up something from Exodus 6th chapter and 25. He acted boldly against the outrage. His anger mirrored the divine anger, according to one of the commentators. Now, was he a vigilante, as we mentioned earlier in Numbers verse 3 and 4? It explains that the priests were responsible for the security of the tabernacle, guarding it against intruders, and killing those who dared to trespass. So Phineas carried out what he considered a responsibility um, by law to take care of, because Moses had just given the command of what was supposed to happen to everyone. Um, but what happened with Samir was an outrageous attack against the holiness of the sanctity of the sanctuary. Now, with the spear drawn and thrown through both bodies, the man first and the woman suggested they were already involved. They immediately became sexually active upon entering the tent. Now, the placement of the tent in location to the entrance of the tabernacle is important. It's also important because of the location of the Mennonite camp and the camp of the Israelites is something that we'll take a look at. So let's go on a little bit more regarding cozy. Okay, it's obvious from the beginning. Okay, first of all, I forgot to mention Zaire is the son of he is a Simonite, and um, he is trained. He's trained to be in the gospel. Now, whether Cozy was one of the local sacred prostitutes is open for interpretation. However, being the daughter of a king, quote, or a chieftain would say that's not to happen. For those commentators of old who say that she was basically a seductress, that's an interesting approach to take on that. So the plague stopped with the death of these two, and Phineas it becomes a hero, a zealot. Okay, he was the one willing to sacrifice all for the good of the tribe. But was it his to do? Was it his to do? Um, because as we stated earlier, uh, the Levites were given this to do, and even among the Levites, if you go back to Leviticus, each one had different responsibilities. So he refused to take part in anything other than this is what's written and this is what I will do. And that is how that happened. So those who died of the plague were 24,000. They were 24,000. And when we talk of Phineas, we talk of him having zeal. So much has been written about Phineas, but not a whole lot about Zaire and Cosby. Let's go on a little further, and we will talk about the next thing that Moses asked the children of Israel to do. They were to harass them, they were to attack, and they were to make war. And this becomes interesting. One of the things we talked about with scapegoating was, okay, you have killed these two. By the way, their names aren't given until after they're there. Their names aren't given until after they're there. So you killed them, and having killed them, you killed the Mennonite woman who was with Zaire, who was a leader among his father's people. And the woman had to be considered a princess because she was the daughter of Zur, one of the five kings of the Mennonite. Uh, so these are not just any people; these are the leaders of the group. So Moses said, "quote harass the Mennonites." Well, God said to Moses, "Harass the Mennonites and attack them, for they harass you with their schemes by which they seduced you in the matter of war and in the matter of Kozai, the daughter of a leader of Midian, their sister, who was killed in the day the plague the plague stopped. So we have the reason being given for a war, a forthcoming war. Now, Zaire, who is the son of Sulu, um, uh, he was actually a leader among the group. And it was given everything to believe that Cosby was also a leader among her people. But it is possible It is possible that there was an arranged marriage made between the fathers of both, but it's not said here in this particular book of Numbers. But there is everlasting shame attached to Zair's name. But both of them came from fathers who were leaders, and they too were leaders in their own right. Zair's name means my remembrance, and he's remembered in a bad way. Koz's name means my lie or my deception, and some of the earlier commentators would weigh out within it said it meant voluptuousness, but anything to make her truly a villain in this particular affair. So harass them and attack them because of their schemes and because of their seduction. So immediately, this encounter between Zaire and Kosley becomes they stand for all of those who have sinned against um, the the those who worship in Baal. They become that. They're not in a grove or anything. They were in the tent, and as some commentators say, in the marriage tent, but we don't know. But they were to be attacked. And as we go through, he said, we have to destroy their cities, and they did kill all five of the kings. And by the way, Balaam was killed too. So that punishment from that first generation goes on and is ended. But if you want to take a look at a different interpretation, Robert Cohen, who writes Women of the Bible for Thinkers, she said that Cosby bristled. She bristled. Now, one of the things that you have to remember, we're still in Numbers 25, so women were still considered the property of the fathers when they were home. When they were married, they became the property of the husband. Any way you do it, they were property, and they had to respond in that manner. And she uses, I do like the word, she uses the word cohabitated. Because I hear cohabitated with Cosby. And in a rage, the priest comes. In a rage, he comes and he stabs them both to death. And it stops the plague. It seems to have done the trick. But that's not the end of the story because we know the aftermath is war. We know that it's absolutely war. We go and we take a look at her name. It's both sexual and it's religious and euphemistically. It can refer to sexual parts, but it may also have been part of her religious. Um, and it could have referred to deities that were associated with her that will later become part of the Israelites. A situation so it automatically alerts the reader that she may have been well known among her people, a prominent person, just as Zaire was among the Israelites. The sanctuary of the stomach, the word translates to belly or in the chamber, having a long history of interpretation. So, one of the things that we want to look at is this chamber in which they went, the temple, not temple, but the tent in which they went. And the fact that the Mennonites did at times use, and she being a princess, she would have used that. And she was pierced in the stomach or pierced in the groin, basically, in the womb, pretty much. So we're going to take a look at that. And as we go through and we take a look at that, remember we talked about from the very beginning that the people at this point had grumbled about the foods, and as the Moabites and Mennonites, they ate the food that was there as part of the worship procedure before going out and having sex under the stars, as it were, but in the stomach. So it's possible that they were not having sex. That's Cosby and Zaire. It's possible that they were not, or that it was, as I said, a shrine pitched on a sacred ground near the Israelites' temple or tent of the assembly. Now, it is possible that because we have holes in this story. In fact, there are commentators who basically say these are actually two stories combined, and you'll find as you go back and read that they don't read smoothly. They're not necessarily connected, okay? But they are stories of interest. Now, she may have been a local diviner, and there are those who will agree that perhaps he brought her in as a diviner, as because she's a priestess, maybe she had some spell or something that could alleviate the plague. That's one train of thought. But much of the commentators will stay with this, that his crime was not that he had sexual relations with her, but that he installed her in the tent um, that that was a shrine to a god, the gods, the idol gods. So it's interesting as we go through. Now the issue with foreign women we'll explore later as we go through, but we gotta remember that Moses had married a foreign woman, Zipporah, and we gotta remember as we go through that Joshua will do the same. Okay? And actually we'll go through that. So we have that, and the possibility of these two being married is out there because both of their fathers were chieftains of their own clans and tribes, and that was a way, it would have been a way to bring them together. They were both powerful and they were distinguished. And as a married couple, they had a right to be in the tent, but we don't know that. Could it have been a rebellion against Moses? We don't know for sure. But the fact that Zamir brought Cosby close to Moses and the whole congregation, many of the commentators see it as a threat, as an affront to Moses' authority. And you'll go through and you'll find some who will actually give verbiage to that effect that he spoke against him. They approached the tent. They didn't go into the tent. They didn't speak to anyone. But a Cohen goes on, as she's a womanist writer. She talks about the fact that this is a rape, not an encounter, but a rape. The use of the spear to pierce through the womb um, it illustrates that the spear was to be used as a phallic symbol, representing the rape of a Mennonite woman. She's not the only one of the womanist or feminist writers who see it as that way. Unfortunately, there's a long history and even a current usage of rape as a military technique to dehumanize and demoralize the enemy. Violence against the body is similar to violence against society. So the rape of a woman in the Hebrew Bible was theft of sexual property. Symbolically raping Cosby, Phineas declared war on the entire body of the Mennonite by taking what was theirs, their property. She was their sister. She was their daughter. And it thus became a holy war. It became a holy war. As we go on down, we'll see other persons who interpret it. What I wanted to do is to take a look at this sedition. Josephus sees it, and as he reads it and as he rewrites it as sedition, as a sedition that occurred in Moab. And as he writes it, because he too was a priest and he also was a military general, he makes Phineas, he leads out this whole encounter and he makes Phineas a hero. He doesn't comment on it, but he makes him a hero. But he does allow Zamir to have a cerebral encounter with Moses. Please notice that it's not verbal in our Bible, but he does it as a cerebral encounter. And he says, you're just giving us all these things that you say come from God. How do we know they come from God? You're trying to take away our freedom and you're trying to enslave us again with all this stuff. And he makes Phineas a military person. So for him, the aftermath of killing Phineas is a military strategy. Now, he says that, and he goes on, and there are other commentators who buy into this whole concept that this is for Hampton. But it is, we have the idea that his account doesn't go with the account of those who had the rabbis who were in Jerusalem and the rabbis those who made up the Sanhedrin at that time, because it became an execution pretty much more than anything else. It's hard to talk about Cosby and Zaire without talking about Phineas. Now, what happened to Phineas? I did mention it earlier, but God, bless him. He gave him the covenant of peace, which is an eternal priesthood position for his lineage. Um, and if you go through, you'll see later on that he does hold the trumpet, and he does become somewhat of a military general. And we go through and we look at another interpretation very quickly. Um, we have to be careful as we go through, especially when we want to say, okay, if Zaire had not brought Cosby into the camp, then the war would not have occurred. That is not quite true, because there is this relationship between Moses and Phineas. We have to go all the way back and remember that Moses killed an Egyptian and buried him in the sand. He did that, and that because there was no verbal conversation, we don't know whether Zamir was approaching him while they were mourning at the opening of the tent or not, because Phineas acted very quickly, and he actually overstepped his bounds according to what was given to the priesthood to do. This political side of the affair is discussed in great detail by many of the commentators who have taken a second look at the encounter of Zaire and Cosby. Okay, it one of the things that we want to mention very quickly is that the location of the tents and the location of the camp. Zaire's union to Cosby would have endangered Israel's security, and this is because of the opportunity for someone to attack the camp. But if we stay basically with what we were told, we will have difficulty. The first thing is that the alliance between the two would have made the southern flank vulnerable to attack, and secondly, it would have caused disunity with Israel, with Moses' supreme authority being tested, and lastly, the relationship between God and the Israelites would have been severely impaired had this union between Zaire and Cosby continued. Now let's go all the way down and take a really quick look from Stephen Fawcett, who talks about the scapegoating. And the scapegoating is based on Renee Girard, who says that when there's a social crisis, sort of like the plague that's killing everyone in the camp, and could have wiped them all out, that as a people we turn to find someone to blame. Now, if we go back to the 16th chapter of Leviticus, we'll find the origin of the word scapegoat, and it has to do when Aaron the priest would get the two goats for the sacrifice. One of them would be sacrificed and one would be let go. The one who was let go, it was believed at that time by the Israelites that after Aaron laid his hand on the goat's head, that they were able to go on out, and that goat would take the transgressions and the sins on out away from the camp. But there is one thing I did not mention, and I want to mention that we haven't talked about Sephora in a moment, other than to say that she was married to Moses. Now, this may have been at Moses' celibate period, but we have to mention that she was present, quote unquote, according to many other commentators. She was president along with the unnamed mother of Phineas, who was also a daughter, well, actually was Zipporah's sister when all this was going on, but she did not speak up. Now, why didn't she speak up? What was she to say? And we talked about silent screaming. There was nothing she could say. Moses was the highest ranking person in the camp, and the sister is married to Aaron, which would have been another high ranking person in the camp. And what are you going to say? You can't defend them because no one's going to stand with you against what Phineas has done. So she had to be, at this point, very alone and very afraid to speak. But she was a Mennonite, and this is a Mennonite. Cosby is a Mennonite who was killed. What's the legacy that we have here? We started off with this premise: at the heart of the book of Numbers is not the question of where the Israelites were located geographically, but where were they found spiritually. Now we've gone through, and I'm not sure I have an answer for it right now. But how should we apply the study of the book of Numbers today? We have to remember about grumbling and complaining and being ungrateful, and just remember what God has actually done for us. We are on a journey too, and Christ travels with us on this journey. So we have to remember Stephen Fawcett, who says in his scapegoat article that it doesn't, we are not getting any better. We're not bettering ourselves spiritually if we decide to go with the scapegoat theory. Let's find someone else to blame for what happened here. It's not what the Lord wants us to do, because God is not this God of vengeance. God is the God of love. And we have to remember that as we go through very quickly. The words of Willa Cather Gaffrey and the words of James Cone. Let's take Cone first. Cone wrote a book about the cross and lynching. He wrote a book about the cross and lynching. And then he says, in it, he basically talks about Cosby and Zaire, and he talks about the burnt offerings. Were these two just used again, not as scapegoats, but was their death more a sacrificial lynching in order to justify something that had to be done? Now here comes focuses on the African Americans who have been lynched in the name of saving the community and making the community safe because of perceived threats. Perceived threats. And Gaffney does the same thing, but she takes hers a little bit further in that she actually went in and did the names of 3 women who were lynched, who were hanged. Now, when Combs talks about burnt offerings or burnt sacrifices, he reminds us that it's so easy for us to get our Bibles in one hand and on the other, as long as it is safe for us. But we have to be careful not to allow fear especially in racial sex, to get in the way, or allegations of serious crimes to get in the way, or those who accuse others of public spectacles that occur, to allow something to be escalated to a large sale by targeting a large number, as was done with African Americans in the community, and using lynching as a means of taking care of that. These are not things that are to be done. But what do we need to do? We have to not allow people to say there's a perceived threat of social disorder, that these bad people are going to come through your window and they're going to attack you as you sleep. Or just speak, and we talked about it before, there's a lack of fairness in the judicial process, or we allow a mob or a group of people to decide justice, vigilante justice. We try to put on display something that is ugly that was done in the night that should come in the day. We cannot continue to intimidate members of foreign groups or members of minority groups. And this unifying effect of cleansing, quote unquote, that's done by the dominant social group is not an acceptable thing that we can do. Gaffney goes on, in her estimation, it's called The Cross and the Lynching Tree. That's the name of Cone's book. Gaffney goes on, when she's talking about the reintroduction to the women in the Bible, she goes on and she says that it makes those persons who do these awful things feel better, uh, but when they are called to task, there absolutely is no justification for that. Now, I would invite you to join me on next week on Wednesday when we move on to the book of Deuteronomy. We'll actually be finishing up. We'll continue to talk about the women who were taken in the war. First of all, Deuteronomy. We'll talk about Deuteronomy and making life better for women in ancient Israel. But we'll talk about those captive women and what happened to them. But we don't want you to forget what happened in Numbers 25. Because the fear of a Moabite king and a social crisis within an Israeli camp and a threat to overthrow a leader who was installed by God, how simple it is to let mob rule take effect, and how easy it is for us to say, oh, that was all right. We won't discuss it anymore. That was done yesterday. What we have to do is remember that it can again be done today. It's just as easy to be done today. I hope you have enjoyed your time with us, and I look forward to, and I thank you very much for joining us. And I look forward to next week and the women of the book of Deuteronomy. Thank you so very much. I have enjoyed my time with you today. There's always more to